Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava, Kamma, Daf Ayin Daled. We're going to start with a quick review of the end of yesterday's daf. We started a topic called Hakasha Lav Tchilat Hazamahi. What does that mean? It doesn't exactly mean what it sounds like literally. What it means is that if somebody gets contradicted in court, which in general we say doesn't really mean anything, what it means is we have contradictory testimony, we have to throw everything out of court. And again, what does it mean Hakasha as opposed to Hazamah? That the argument is about the people that we're talking, the Balei Din, not about the witnesses. When witnesses come and say, oh, we have a problem with the witnesses, then we accept that testimony, whether we say they're psulim laha'id, that's just a regular, you stole. So if you stole, you can't be a witness. Or if they say, we were with you on that day and it can't be, you saw the testimony. That's eidim zomemim, and then we accept the second group and we reject the first group, and the first group has to pay what they tried to do to the other. Like I said, in Masechet Makot, we'll learn a lot about this. But if they say, we saw someone kill somebody else, and the other person says, we were there and there was no murder that happened, or we saw someone else kill the person, or some sort of contradictory testimony, then we don't know who to believe, and we basically say, you're both out of court. But comes Rav and he says, it's true, we might say you're both out of court. But if someone comes later and does hazamah to one of them, then we basically punish them. It's not like we say it's as if you never testified because we threw you out of court. Abaye disagrees with this, which is the first thing we're going to see on today's daf. Abaye is going to say, no, I don't think you're right. Once they're contradicted and they're out. And they're both going to prove it from a braita. So let's start with just learning this braita. And I'm going to bring up the study guide, and we're going to learn first the braita in its entirety. And then we're going to see what Rava and Abaye each do with this braita, because this is the braita that we already used yesterday that stood as a basis of Rava's approach. What I want to do now, just to make it a little easier to follow the daf, because it's quite complicated, because we're going to read these braitas in a bunch of different ways. But I want to point out all the difficulties with this braita, and then I think that will help us for today. So there's a reisha and a seifa. Yesterday we only saw the reisha, which is the first part of it. If somebody comes and says, Simeat ein avdo v'hi pilat sheno. Okay, so witnesses come and say, this master, okay, let's call him Joe. Joe blinded his Canaanite slave's eye, and then after that, he knocked out his tooth. Now, an assumption, which actually we're going to question later, but the assumption is that he goes free from knocking out the eye. Once he's free from knocking out the eye, then when the master knocks out the tooth, he has to pay him damages for it. And then the braita said, remember the words, the braita said, let me just find it inside. Sorry, I'm looking for the words. Okay. Shaharei harav omerkin. Now this is in the best interest of the master. And then it says, which is a very strange phrase, and then it said, if they became zomemim, these witnesses, mishalmim demei ayin la'eved. They have to pay the value of what the master would have had to pay. They're causing a loss to the slave. They would have caused a loss to the slave of not getting the value of the eye, and that's what they have to pay. Okay, there's major problems with this. Number one, let's start with the end. They never said that the master needed to pay for the eye. They said on account of the eye, the guy was supposed to go free. On account of the tooth, the master was going to pay. So if they became zomemim, number one, they should have paid the value of the tooth and not the value of the eye, because they were trying to say the master should have paid for the breaking of the tooth. And now that turns out they lied, right? They tried to, I just got confused about one thing. Right. They have to pay the value of the eye to the Eved because they're making him lose out on that by having lied. Okay, that doesn't really make any sense at all. We're going to have to figure out what that is. And then we're going to have a problem because they should have paid the master the value for losing their slave, because what they claimed was you had to set the slave free. Okay, so that's weird. And the third thing is, why is this in the best interest of the master, what they said? That doesn't make any sense either, right? In other words, theoretically, they should have had to, what we would have thought if we read this simply, and this way it really makes no sense, Blinding the eye of the slave would have made him go free. So basically, they should have to pay the value of the slave to the master. And knocking out the tooth would mean the master would have had to pay for knocking out the tooth. So they should have to pay the master for the tooth. So the whole thing doesn't really make any sense. Okay? So now, because of that, Rav is going to have a whole different interpretation, and later we're going to see Abaye. But before we get to there, the seifa actually makes a lot more sense, but there's still one issue here, and only one issue though. If the witnesses say he peeled a chain of dough, he knocked out the tooth and then knocked out the eye, which is the reverse order, and the braita there is going to say, Shaharei ha'eved omer ken. This is in the best interest of the eved. Now, this actually fits perfectly, because to say this, the eved gets the maximum. What does this slave get? Gets his freedom and gets the money for the eye, which is more than the tooth. So we use the example we gave yesterday, which is, let's say the eye is worth 100 and the tooth is worth 50. So the eved's going to get the maximum amount of money here. So it's actually really good for the eved, and that works totally great. Nimtzeu zomemim, and this part also works. If they become zomemim, mishamim dmei ayin larav. Then what did they try to do? And this makes perfect sense. They tried to make the master pay for an eye, so they have to pay for the eye to the master. What doesn't make sense? What's missing here? Only one thing is missing, that he should have had to also pay for the fact that he wanted to free the slave, right? Because he should pay the value of a slave to the master, because that's what he was trying to do. So that question, which we have both on the Reisha and on the Seifa, is still missing, which is going to make everybody have to come up with some other interpretation of this braita, that there was more going on here, which basically we already know. At least part of what was more going on is that there were two sets of witnesses who both agreed that something happened. It's just they thought it was a different order, okay? Because if they both agreed that the master did something to the slave, and in fact, two things to the slave, right? It's just a matter of what order, then there's no issue here of kasher zamam that he tried to free the slave, because everyone agrees that the slave was going to be freed. Okay, so that's a basic you have to understand. So basically what we had yesterday was on account of the three questions which I already went through in the Reisha. The way Rava explains the first case is that, okay, here's the chart on the page, and we'll go through here. The master, according to the first group of witnesses, first knocked out the tooth and then knocked out the eye, which would mean, okay, I added a column here. What would have had to happen if those witnesses were the witnesses? In fact, they are the right witnesses. Then the master should free the slave and pay for the eye. The second group, which if you remember is our group, which is good for the master, right? Because the first group isn't good for the master at all. He has to pay the maximum and free the slave. The second group comes along and says, first the eye, then the tooth. So the eye set the guy free. The tooth is what you have to pay for, which is less money. So basically, that's the second group that's going to become the eidim that are knocked out. First, they're hukhashu, because here we have contradictory testimony. What happened? Now, again, everyone agrees that the slave has to be freed, right? The master has to free the slave. That happens anyway. But how much money you have to pay is a matter of debate. Then, so therefore, there's contradictory testimony. Later, we're going to point out that there's a problem with this, with claiming this is contradictory testimony, but we'll get there soon. So we now have a contradiction. So first, the second group becomes contradicted by the first, and the first becomes contradicted by the second. But then comes the third group, and the third group said, wait a minute, we were with the second group. You couldn't have possibly said that, which means that now they become zomemim, which was Rava's whole proof. First they were knocked out, then they became zomemim. And now what do they have to pay? Now this explains why it says they paid Demei Ayin La'eved, because what were they really trying to do? They were trying to deprive the slave of the money for the eye. The first group had said eye. They said, oh no, only tooth got knocked out second. So they have to pay the difference, which in this case is 50. It's 100 minus the 50. They have to pay the difference between the Demei Ayin to the Demei Shein of the loss they tried to cause to the master. And now that makes perfect sense. Of course, you have to add some other details, but in the sense that makes perfect sense. Comes Rava and says, Abaye and says, okay, we're at the bottom of Ayin Gimel Amud Bet. Lo, ta'afchinu v'azminu. The first thing you have to understand is that Abaye says there's only two groups of witnesses. And it's not a case where there was first denial, hakasha, and then hazama, turning them into zomemim. It all happened at the same time by the same witnesses. So let's understand. So he says, first of all, how does he get that there's only two groups? Well, he proves it from the Seifa. What he's going to say is, okay, Rava proved his whole thing from the Reisha, which actually I'll set up already so you have a sense when we get there. Soon we're going to actually reject that he learned it from the Reisha, because I mentioned that there was a bit of a problem here with claiming this is a Durak Kasha, which I didn't say what it is yet. But they're then going to say, oh no, he proves it actually from the Seifa instead of the Reisha. But right now we think that Rava proves it from the Seifa, from the Reisha, sorry, from the first part. Comes Abaye and he says, I'm going to prove that if the Seifa is with two groups of witnesses, and I'll show you how I can prove that, the Reisha must also be with two sets of witnesses and not three, like you say, Rava, and that there is no Hakasha here that comes before the Hazama, and therefore I don't agree with your theory that Hakasha is the beginning of Hazama. I think that if you really contradict witnesses, they're thrown out of court entirely, and if you come later and there is zomemim, mizimim that caused them to be zomemim, we don't accept it, they don't get punished. So now, what does he say? Mimai, how do I get this? So he says, mi deseifa b'meipach b'hazama, reishanami b'meipach b'hazama. We don't know yet what meipach b'hazama is, we'll explain in a minute. But he basically says, since the seifa is two groups of witnesses, and they flip and do, in other words, they both have opposite approaches, and the second ones also do the hazama, then the Reisha is in the same case, meaning there aren't three groups. Let's read. Dekatani seifa. And this we already read, but I'll read it again inside. Mi'idani et ish ploni shehipila chain avdo. Okay, here's the case in the chart. First, the first group comes and says Shane and then ayin. Okay, v'simei eteno. Shaharei ha'eved omer kin. Now remember, what is this? So he knocks out the tooth and then he knocks out the eye. And then that's great for the eved, we said, because he gets the maximum, he goes free and gets the maximum amount of money. But then it turns out they were zomemim, mishamim demei ayin lara. That's just the quote. Okay, if they become zomemim, they have to pay the amount of the eye that they made the master pay. They have to pay them. Hechidami, what's the case? Remember what our biggest problem was. Our only problem with that was what happened to the payment to the master of freeing the slave. You should have had to pay the value of a slave because they were coming and saying something that no one else had said. Okay. Right now, we're just looking at the simple reading. We didn't say there were two groups that said opposite things. So and now we're going to prove it must be someone said the opposite. Otherwise, he would have had to pay that. If the second group of witnesses that were the mizimim, the ones who knocked them out, hadn't said anything about that the master knocked something out of the slave, then demei kule eved l'rav by shalumele. This is what we said before. The master, the eidim zomemim, the ones who lied, would have had to compensate also the master for having freed the slave. Ela pshita, right, for having tried to cause him to free a slave. So basically pay the value of a slave. So since that's the case, ela pshita de kamodulu kulu b'chavala. It must be they both agree there was a chavala here. And as you see in the chart, right, the second group came and said, no, you got the details wrong. I agree with you that the master knocked some things out of the slave. But they flip the order, and at the same time they say, okay, let's play it out. And most people say it goes in this order. The second group comes to court. So the first group said, I made it simpler. I got out all the words just so you see. Shane, tooth, and then eye. Comes the second group and they say, oh, you claimed it happened like this? Number one, we were with you on that day that you claim you testified and in some other place. So there's no way that you claim you saw the action. There's no way you saw what transpired. Number two, we saw him do it on a different day and we saw it was in the opposite order. Eye and then tooth. So now, hechidami. Now they want to say, okay, now in what order? Okay, so first of all, we already got the case now because now we see what happens here is that they flip the order. So now again, play it out. The real thing that happened was what the second group said, which was the second thing was the tooth. So the payment has to be on the tooth. So now that the first group became zomemim, and the hakasha, all the denial and the fight between them, all happened at the same time. So their testimony is both contradicted and huzam, because they both say, you were with us at that time. No way could that have happened. And they say, and the details you got wrong as well. So because it all happens at the same time, you don't learn anything from here about hakasha is the beginning of hatama, and that if first there's hakasha and then hazama, because this all happened at the same time. So it teaches you nothing about that. And now what's the law? The law is that since they tried to say ayin, they have to compensate the master on the loss, the difference between what he would have paid for the eye and what he paid for the tooth. 100 minus 50 is 50. And that's all, because they don't have to compensate on the slave, because the slave going free, because the slave anyway would have gone free based on the second testimony. Everybody agrees on that. Okay, but now we have a minor thing, which I find minor in this whole thing, but it's still a point they're going to make. Hechidami, what's the case exactly of who testified about what day? Okay, so let's say someone testifies about Sunday, it happened. Someone testifies it happened on Monday, and let's say we're on Tuesday right now, and first comes the first group, then comes the second group. So if the second group that comes, batrai is the later, testifies about the later day as well, meaning comes in the first group and says it was tooth and then eye, and it happened on Sunday. Comes the second group and says, hey, we were with you on Sunday, somewhere else. You couldn't have testified. And by the way, it happened in the end. It happened in the opposite order, and it happened on Monday. Well, if that's the case, let's just think about it. When they on Sunday tried to get the master to free his slave, and really it only happened on Monday, they actually should still get punished for trying to free the slave, because he should still have to pay the value of the slave, because on Sunday, he wasn't yet obligated to free the slave. So that should be, they tried to do something that hadn't happened yet. So they say here, Akate dmei eved l'Rabbi shlume. He should, in this case, if their testimony was Sunday, and the truth was that it happened on Monday, they should also have to pay. Because he hadn't, by Sunday, he hadn't yet been obligated to free his slave. So they were basically saying, you had to free your slave a day earlier than it really should have happened. So they should have to pay that also. Ella, so it must be, the kamakadme kadume hani batrai, must be that the first group came and said, we saw him knock out the eye and the tooth and then the eye on Monday. And then the second group said, oh no, it happened before on Sunday. And that would be a case where you wouldn't have to pay the value for the slave, because anyway, he was already from before liable to, obligated to free a slave. But even within that, it's more complicated. If he hadn't yet, it's true, right? They claim that on Monday, that was the case. That's what happened. But the second group of witnesses only came to court on Tuesday. So when they claim it happened on Monday, even though he had really done it on Sunday, still until he was convicted in court, he still is causing the master to have to free the slave when maybe the master will never have to free the slave. Now, why not? If the master already did it on Sunday, theoretically he would. But what? There's one point that it's important here. If the master comes forward, okay, freeing your slave is a knas, it's a penalty. So even though on Sunday the master knocked out the eye of the slave, or whichever one happened first, right? Now, I guess it was the eye in that case. And then on Tuesday, they come to court and say, listen, you knocked out the eye, but they lied. Now, and it happened on Monday. Now, theoretically, on Monday, they claim on Monday it happened. On Monday, since he wasn't yet convicted in court, he theoretically could go forward to the court on his own and admit that he had done this, in which case he wouldn't actually have to free the slave. If you come and admit, you don't have to free the slave. So basically, it's not clear that he's going to end up having to free the slave. So they should still be liable. Kasher zamam. They definitely, by their testimony, if they had been accepted as true witnesses and not knocked out, and that's the whole thing we want to figure out, they could have made him free the slave, whereas he might not have had to. It wasn't necessarily a done deal, because he could still come forward and admit and say, oh, listen, I did it, but because he admits it, he won't have to free. So because Akate Gavar Lo Mechayev, since he wasn't yet obligated, therefore it also doesn't make sense. So why isn't, they're still very bothered by why isn't he paying the amount of the slave to the master? It must be that he actually was already convicted in court. So now what's the debate? The debate now turns into what happened was he was convicted in court of having to free a slave. But what? He ran away and didn't free a slave. And now come two contradictory witnesses that claim, what was he convicted of? What happened in the other court? They're now like in a different city, let's say, nobody really knows. And they're claiming, oh, it was eye tooth, and they're claiming tooth eye, and they're saying, oh, you were with us, and it can't be that you're claiming you saw the judgment happen like this. And then it switches the whole case. And then you can say, oh, and that's why, since there was already a conviction that he had to free the slave, that's why they're not obligated for freeing the slave. Okay, so that was a side point about the whole, why isn't the freeing the slave, the paying the value of the slave to the owner, why isn't it mentioned here? But now we're going to go back to Rava. So again, Rava thinks 3 sets of witnesses, and then it was first Hakasha, then Hazama. Abaye thinks 2 sets of witnesses, and the Hakasha and the Hazama happened at the same time. Both the contradictory testimony and the denial, and the Hazama, the making them eidim zomemim. And that's why this doesn't teach you anything about what if first there was Hakasha and then Hazama. Okay. Now comes Rav Achabared, Rav Ika, and as I told you before, we understood Rava as understanding it, learning it all from the first part of the braita. Now he's going to say that can't possibly be. Okay, let's read it inside. Amalei Rav Achabared, Rav Ika, Rav Ashi. Duki to Rava Behecha. Where is he learning it from? Ilema mireisha. Reisha mika mitkashe mitziai. Let's go back to Rava. Let's look at the chart. According to Rava, right, there's 3 kitei eidim here, 3 groups. The first one says shein and ayin. The second one says ayin and shein. So basically, let's just go back. The first one would have said the master frees and has to pay 100. Let's just go with our numbers. It's much easier to see the problem here. The second one says the master frees and pays 50. Now, is that testimony contradicted? Not really, because even the first agrees he owes 50. It's just the first agrees he owes 50 plus another 50. Okay? But the second one, which is the one who becomes the Eidei Azamad, that he claims is all about contradiction, right? You were contradicted, wasn't actually contradicted. And that's based on a principle that we're going to see in a minute. Yesh bichlal matayim maneh. 200 includes 100 in it, or 100, right? When you say 200, it includes 100 and 100, right? So it's like the whole is a sum of its parts, which means basically that if there's an argument over a claim of 100 and an argument, the other one says 200, the 200 is contradicted by the 100 because the 100 says he only owes 100. But the one who says 100 is not contradicted because the 200 guy agreed that they owe 100, just says, and 100 more. So let's read it inside now. In the Reisha, there is no hakasha to the second group. Okay, in the first section of this braita, the way you understood it. Kevandi ilo mitazme, if the in becomes zomemim, sahaduta kavatayu kakaima. No matter what, we would have ruled like them because we would have said, right? We have contradictory testimony. One says you free him and pay 100. The other says you free him and pay 200. So what's the common denominator between them? You free them and pay 100. Okay, so didina kavatayu paskina, you would hold like them. Diyesh b'chal matayim maneh, because that's not contradictory. Hilkach kamayu dekamikashe mitziai lo mitkashe midi. So the one that gets contradicted here is the first group. Their testimony is contradicted because they claim it's more money. And then the second group is the one who become muzamim. They become eidim zomemim. Somebody knocks them out and says, we were with you. This third group comes. And therefore, you can't say hakasha is tchilat hazaman because the hakasha happened to one group and the hazama happened to the other group. So that doesn't teach you anything. So he says, I don't get Rava's proof at all. It makes no sense. To which Rav Ashi is going to answer him. Okay, we're now down at the bottom here. Rav Ashi is going to say, Rava savar mideresha b'shalosh kitot sefer nami b'shalosh. Okay, we're now at the bottom chart on the first side of the page of the sheet. Rava says, no, what he proved from the Reisha was just that there's 3 groups, because remember, the Reisha had a lot more problems than the Sefer. So because of the 3 issues we have at the Reisha, the only way Rava could explain it was that there's 3 groups of witnesses. Once he says the Reisha has three groups of witnesses, then you're going to say the Seifa also must have three groups of witnesses, because we're going to assume the cases are parallel. In which case, right now, by the way, he does the exact reverse that Abaye did. What did Abaye do? Abaye said the second case can be explained with two groups of witnesses. So let's explain the first case as well with two groups of witnesses, and that's how he rejected Rava. But Rava is going to do the same thing, but in the reverse. Since the Reisha definitely has three groups of witnesses, then the Seifa also does. And now let's play out the Seifa. And then he actually derives the whole thing from the Seifa, because in the Seifa, you're going to have the same group that became knocked out is the same group that became zomemim. Kigon, de'atu beit treva amre, he pilat sheno v'simeit eno. So the first group came and said, and they're the group that's mentioned by wording in the braita, because remember, the braita only mentions one group of witnesses. The braita at the top of the page, you can look again, midani dish planishi pilat shen avdo v'simeit eno. First tooth, then eye, which means again, they tried to get the guy to pay the maximum payment possible. And then Paskina Ladina Pumayu. And then they ruled like this set of witnesses. Then Atu Beitreachrini, two other witnesses come, Va'ambre Simete Novi Pilachino. And then they say the opposite, which means now they're saying, oh no, he doesn't have to pay the maximum. He only has to pay half that amount, which again contradicts the first. Now we're going to have that the first group was contradicted, and they're also the group that became zomemim, because they're the group mentioned by word in the braita. Now, zomemim Kamma, and the first group becomes zomemim. Mishamim Dmei Ayin Larav. Now, again, what do they have to do? They tried to get the master to pay the value of the eye instead of the value of the tooth. So they have to pay the value of the eye minus the value of the tooth, which anyway he had to pay. They have to pay that 50 shekels or $50 or whatever amount it is, 50 zuz, to the master. Okay? Now, there's Rava's proof. This first group was first contradicted because the second group said he doesn't have to pay that much. And then they became zomemim. And there you see that. And that's Rava's proof. So we now went back to Rava and we changed his proof. His proof is not from the first part because there's really no contradiction there on the second group. And it's on the second part, and it ends up being the first group is both contradicted and then huzam, and that's how you prove. Now we're going to go back to Abaye. And now we're going to say, Abaye is going to actually somewhat agree with Rava and say the following, but yet disagree. Abaye amar lecha, bishlam aresha lo sage de lo shalosh kito. He says, you know what? I could agree with you that maybe the first part of the Mishnah really is three groups of witnesses. Okay? Until now, what did we say? Since the Seifa is two, the Reisha is two, according to Abaye. And Rava said, since the Reisha is three, the Seifa has three groups. So Abaye says to him, look, maybe it's like me, where I think we're going to learn about the Reisha from the Seifa. You know, the Seifa is two, then the Reisha is two, and I disagree with the way you understood the Reisha. But now that Rava's whole proof is from the Seifa, it really doesn't matter about the Reisha. So he says, look, I'll give you that maybe the Reisha really is three groups of witnesses. But Ela Seifa, which is where you prove it from, Lama li shalosh kitot. Why do you have to go so far? Now remember, this is what I set up in the beginning to show you, which is the Seifa is not so complicated. The simple reading of the Seifa makes a lot of sense. Sharia Eved Omerkin, and you want to say the problem is Sharia Eved Omerkin? Eved koldu humeimar. Amar denichale denifuk lecherut. He says there's no problem like in the Reisha. The Reisha had this problem because it was good for the master. It certainly wasn't good for the master to say you knocked out the eye and you knocked out the tooth. You know, that certainly wasn't good for him. So because of that, you came up with this, there must be three groups. But in the Seifa, we don't have that problem because the Seifa says, you know, you came and said, knocked out the tooth and blinded the eye. That's great for the Eved, and that's exactly what the braita says. So it's not so complicated there. You don't have to start making theories that there were three groups of witnesses, right? Remember, we only had that one problem, which is they must all agree. There must be agreement about freeing the slave. Otherwise, he would have had to compensate the master for that. But, right, so therefore, that's the only issue. So that you can resolve by having two groups of witnesses and not needing three. And again, therefore, I think there's only two in the Seifa, and because there's only two in the Seifa, that's why I disagree with you. There isn't Hakasha and Hazama. It all happens at the same time. Now we have a very side problem, which I kind of made reference to before, but not too much. And we're going to see that right now. We don't really need the chart for this. The study guide. Makifla Rabbi Zera. The whole premise of the braita was, Ein simeteno, nipuk be'eno. Hipilat shino nepuk b'shino. Okay, this isn't saying anything yet. This is just saying, okay, we get that. If you knock out an eye, the slave goes free. You knock out a tooth, the slave goes free. Cement eno v'hipilat shino. What have we said now? According to this, top of Amud Bet, if you knock out the eye and then you knock out the tooth, or the reverse, what did we say? Knocking out the eye freed the slave, or knocking out whatever you started with freed the slave. The second one, already the slave is considered free, even though they haven't ruled on it, right? And this all happened, and it could have happened in a span of 2 minutes. But because knocking out the eye, let's say, sets the slave free, when you knock out the tooth, you now have to pay damages because the slave is Jewish right now, became, right, freed, which turns them into a Jew, and then you have to pay them for damages. They're no longer a slave. So you have to pay the damages. But why wouldn't we just say, why don't we just say a slave goes free if you knock out one thing, and he goes free if you knock out 2 parts of the body, and who says you have to pay them for it? So Amar Abaye, Alecha Amar Kra, right? And that was the whole premise of how we got to this whole thing, right? Which is obvious that that's the halacha. It's just a question of why is that the halacha? Because otherwise there wouldn't be paying demei eno or paying demei shino and all that we had in the braita. There would be no paying of value of anything. Alecha Amar Kra, tachat eno v'lo tachat eno v'shino, tachat shino v'lo tachat shino v'eno. What Rabbi is picking up on is the pasuk describes what happens if you knock out an eye, and the next pasuk describes what happens when you knock out a tooth. And when it says, Kia ke'ishet ein avdo et ein amatof, you knock out the eye of your slave or female maidservant, v'shichatan, you destroy it, lachofshi yishachenu tachat eno. They go free. If you remember, we darshan the whole shichatan, lachofshi when we were in Adamu ad olam, the beginning of the Masechet. Anyway, they get freed tachat eno on account, right, in place of the eye that they lost. And then if shein avdo or shein amato yapil, if it was a tooth, lachofshi yishachenu tachat shino. So what do they say? Eno appears in place of the eye, and then it says in place of the tooth. It seems very clear it's in place of the eye, in place of the tooth. But if it were to be in place of both, then there would be no in place of both. And therefore, you'd have to pay for one. Okay, one would set them free, the other you would have to pay for. Now, that was a real aside. Now we're going to get back to our topic. And now we're going to say that Rav Idi, and now we're going to understand why this sugya was here in the first place, which you might have been wondering. I'm Rav Idi Av Ana Nami Tanina. I can prove Rava from our Mishna. The Hakasha is the beginning of Hasaman. Now, why is that? And now we're going to go through a sugya that we saw yesterday, which had 3 different readings of the Mishnah. They started with one. They said it can't be that. It must be the second. And then even that had a problem, and they gave a third. Today, we're just going to do 1 and 2. We're going to start with 1, use that as a proof for our point, say, no, the Mishnah reads like this. For some reason, it's kind of strange because yesterday we said, oh, even that isn't right. We're going to have a 3rd reading. But this is going to stop at the 2nd reading. I'm Rabbi Idi Bar Avin, so we can learn this from our Mishnah. If there's witnesses that come and say you stole, and then those same witnesses come and say, and then you slaughtered or sold, nimtzeu zomemim, and then they become zomemim, both on the gneva and on the tficha or mechira. Mishalmim lo et hakol. The eidim zomemim, we tried to get him to pay 4 or 5 times, would have to pay the 4 or 5 times. My love, now, is it not the case? Now, what was the order? Okay, so first they testified about the theft, that makes sense. Then they testified about the tficha and mechira, that he slaughtered or stole it, or sold it. And then, so that happened, right, on Tuesday, they come to court and say, on Monday he stole, on Tuesday he slaughtered. And then, right, let's say, or Monday they came, so let's do it like this. Tuesday they come to court and say he stole on Sunday, sorry. Tuesday, they came and said he stole on Monday. Wednesday, they came and said he slaughtered on Monday. Okay, so we have Sunday, Monday, the actions occurred. Tuesday, Wednesday, the testimonies happened. And then, on Thursday, they say, oh, wait, we were with you on Sunday when you testified about the theft, and they became zomemim. And then on Friday, they came and they said, oh, and we were with you also on Monday when you say they slaughtered, so it can't be you testified. What you testified on Wednesday was obviously wrong. Now, if that's the order, they're just assuming, because Geneva always comes before Tficha. So not only did they testify that Geneva happened before the Tficha, but also they were knocked out in that order. First, they were knocked out for the Geneva, then the Tvicha. You might remember, we talked about this yesterday. Now we're going to say some other issue. Now this is going to prove Rava. Once you say that they didn't steal on Sunday, then when the witnesses on Wednesday said they slaughtered this animal on Monday and they're liable 4 or 5, that's already now that testimony is contradicted. Because if they didn't steal, then they're not liable 4 or 5 for slaughtering. So that testimony becomes contradictory testimony. That would be hakasha. And then, right, katane, it says when they do then afterwards, the next day, let's say, do hazama to those witnesses on the tvicha, on the slaughtering, katane mishamim lo et hakol, they have to pay the 4 or 5. But if they were knocked out, and we say once you're knocked out, contradicted, well, we throw you out of court, and there's no, right, like Abaye tries to say, you wouldn't be huzam on that anymore. Well, here you see you are. Right? Do you want to hold like Abaye? You shouldn't have to pay for the tvicha because your tvicha was contradicted as soon as they knocked out the Geneva testimony. So here's our proof from the Mishna. But like we did yesterday, for a different reason we did this yesterday. But we said it must be they contradicted them about, they knocked them out, not contradicted. They knocked out the testimony of the tvicha first. When they came on Wednesday and they said, oh, you were with us. First they said, you were with us at the time you say the slaughtering happened. Then the next day they say, you were with us when the theft happened. By the way, it doesn't have to be next day. I'm just using those as examples. It could be years later. It could be an hour later. Okay. But the point is they did it in that order. Okay. And then there was no hakasha. And then this doesn't prove anything. Now the Gemara is going to say that this machloket that we have between Rav and Abaye, that is basically the topic we've been talking about all day, is hakasha, tchilat hazama, meaning you could have a kasha and then you can have hazama. You can have the witnesses be knocked out, by contradictory testimony, but then still later they could be punished for hazama for that same testimony or not. This plukta is also machloket between Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar. Ube plukta, meaning this machloket is a machloket somewhere else. Eidim cheshu levasof huzmu. Here you have it explicitly. Witnesses that were knocked out and then they were knocked out by contradictory testimony and then became eidim zomemim because someone said you were with us on that day. No way you could have been there. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Elazar, chadamar neheragim, chadamar ein neheragim. Let's say it was capital punishment crime you were talking about that you lied about. So one says you would get killed when you became, even though in the beginning that, you came and said they so-and-so killed so-and-so. And the other guy said, hey, I know he didn't kill so-and-so and so-and-so, okay? Or something like that. It didn't happen. And, right, maybe I was with the guy you claim was murdered on that same day somewhere else. And then, so they contradict them. And then later, two other witnesses come and say, hey, we were with you witnesses on the day you say the murder happened. No way, no how. They would get killed. Okay, they would get the punishment. And Chadamar ein neheragim, the other one says, no, they already got contradicted, thrown out of court. They don't get any punishment. So now we're going to try to figure out who says what. Rabbi Elazar, if you remember, was the student of Rabbi Yochanan. To stein to Rabbi Elazar hu damar ein neheragim, he must be the one who says they don't get killed, like Abaye. To Amar Rabbi Elazar, eidim shukcheshu b'nefesh lokin. Okay, now you have to know some other halacha, which we'll see in a minute. If you were contradicted, let's say that case, I claim someone murdered so-and-so. And then someone said, no way, no how, because the murderer was with the murderer or the one murdered was with us on that day somewhere else, and contradictory testimony. Well, I got knocked out. I get lashes. Now, this is strange. We're going to have to ask, why do I get lashes? Because how do we know I'm the one lying? That's the whole point. We don't know who's lying, who's not. Anyway, we'll put that aside for right now. Soon we'll have an answer to that. I'm going to get lashes for that testimony. Now, Rabbi Elazar says, and here you have to know some other halachic principle. If he says that theoretically later on down the road, I could get the death penalty for this because I could still become huzam, then I wouldn't be able to get lashes now. Why not? Because this is what you call a lo taseh. I lied under court. I shouldn't lie, right? It says in the Torah. And, right, lo ta'ana l're'achai shaker. And it's something that eventually I could be held liable by a beit din and killed. And kol lav shenitan l'azhar mita beitin ein lo kanal. You don't get lashes if it's something that the court theoretically could kill you for. So it must be Rabbi Elazar. You must think that you can't get the death penalty because akasha is the end game, and that's why you get lashes. So that's how we prove it. But tistayim. So we now know he's the one who said that, and Rabbi Yochanan is the one who holds like Rav. To which the Gemara says, Lokin, how on earth could I get lashes for contradictory testimony? Smocha treyu treininu. It's 2 against 2. How do we know that I was lying? Right? Maybe the other guys are lying. That's the whole idea. That's what we started with. And that's the whole idea of contradictory witnesses. It must be a case where I said Joe killed Jack. And then Jack shows up on his 2 feet on the street. Then it's clear that I was the one who was lying, and then I would get lashes for that. Okay, so it would have to be a case where it's 100% clear that I was the one lying. It's just, we can't kill me because that's not zomemim, but we would give me lashes. Okay, and then again, according to Rabbi Elazar, if I'm getting lashes, it must be that I can't down the road get killed if someone were to say, oh, we were with you on that day. Okay, because otherwise I wouldn't get lashes. New Mishna. Now we have the parallel Mishna to the previous, which is all the cases where you're not going to pay 4 or 5. 2 witnesses said you stole, but only 1 witness said that you slaughtered or sold, which is an obvious halacha. The Gemara is going to say, obviously, you're not going to pay 4 or 5 if there's only 1 witness that says you slaughtered. Why are we even saying this? But we'll get there in a minute. Notice which 2 cases go together here. So that's going to be what they're going to in the end learn something from. Or al piatzmo. Or if the person admits that they slaughtered it, then, right, in other words, 2 witnesses came and said, I stole. But then I come forward and I admit that I slaughtered it after, then I'm exempt, because remember, modet biknas patur. If I admit about some sort of penalty, which is the 4 or 5 payment is a penalty, I don't have to pay. So I would have to pay the kefel, I wouldn't have to pay the extra 2 or 3. So mishalem tashlumei kefel ve'eno mishalem tashlumei arba v'chamisha, because kefel there were witnesses about. That I didn't admit in court. Ganav v'tabach b'shabbat, ganav v'tabach l'avodah zarah. This is the 2 cases where I get the death penalty. Because I get the death penalty, kimle b'derava minei, I won't get payment. Ganav mishal aviv umet aviv, achar kach tabach umachar. We learned this also. I stole from my father, then my father died, and then I inherited it, but so did my brothers. And then I slaughtered it when it was partially mine. I don't pay because it has to be fully not mine. Ganav v'hikdish. If I stole it, and then we had a whole debate. Who was makdish? But somebody was makdish. Because it's no longer in the ownership of the person, right? It's not owned anymore because it was sanctified. It belongs to God. Rabbi Shimon Omer, depends what kind of kodashim. We saw this already. Also, kodashim shachayab achriyutan. If you said, I will bring the sacrifice, and then I will bring a sacrifice, and then I designate the animal, and someone steals the animal, then I'll have to replace that animal because I took upon myself. That's chayab achriyut. I'm responsible, which means I'll now have to pay out of pocket. Because of that, the ganav will have to pay me arba v'chamisha, because he holds, if you remember, davar hagorem lemamon kemamon dami, something that might, even though it doesn't have value because it's not really mine, it's sanctified to the temple, but since I will have to spend money to replace it, it already is considered like it's mamon, and therefore there is 4 or 5 payment on it. But if I don't have to, like I said, this animal will be sanctified, and then they steal the animal and I don't have to replace it, well, then they don't have to pay me back. So the Gemara asks, pshita, isn't that obvious? Amre, as I already mentioned, right? Well, obviously, if there's only 1 witness on the tvicha, you're not going to have to pay. They put those 2 together to show, we'll learn this one halacha, and we'll stop here. If there was 1 witness, so that's not enough to convict me. But if another witness comes, then the 2 will join and they'll be able to convict me. Likewise, if I admit it. Now, if I admit it, that's not the end game. I'm exempt for right now. But if witnesses come later, and this is a big subject of debate, we're going to see it in a second, but according to this, it's similar, that if 2 witnesses were to come later and convict me, even though I admitted it in court, I still have to pay the knas. Okay? We've learned this before, right? So, al piatzmo nami ki atu eidim mechayve. Even though I admitted it, if witnesses come after, right, this is to preclude me from knowing there's witnesses coming, running to the court first and saying, oh, by the way, I admit, and get myself out of payment. Now, this is to go against what Rav Huna says in the name of Rav. To Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav modeh b'knas v'achar kach ba'u eidim patur. He disagrees with this. So our Mishnah, basically the inference from our Mishnah goes against something that Rav was quoted as saying by Rav Huna. Okay, that if as soon as I admit it in court, I'm exempt, it doesn't matter if witnesses come later. And we're going to start tomorrow with the Gufa and understand Rav Huna's statement in the name of Rav, and then we're going to bring a problem with it, and we'll go on from there. So what we mainly saw today, as a summary, was these two views of Abaye and Rava about hakashat chilat hazama or not. If you're contradicted in court, can you also later be convicted of being zomemim on that same testimony? Rava says yes. Abaye says no. They prove it from the different ways of reading that braita. And in the end, right, either from, remember, there was a question, did they learn from the Reisha, did they learn from the Seifa? And do we assume whatever the case is in the Reisha is the same in the Seifa or the reverse, right? We first thought that everybody was doing that. Then Abaye said, well, maybe you can distinguish. I can even agree with you about the Reisha, but the Seifa, certainly you have to explain the way I do. In the end, they kind of say they both learned it from the Seifa, and in different ways, obviously, and with their 3 groups of witnesses, with their 2 groups of witnesses, that we went through all those details. And then we said also Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Elazar have the same disagreement. And then we moved to the next Mishna, which we didn't really get too much into, but we saw the first thing from it was this inference that if you admit in court and then witnesses come, you then will be obligated to pay the knas, which goes against something that Rav said. With that, we'll finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day.